Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Should you rent the American dream instead of buying it? Real estate moguls are buying up homes across the country and then sprucing them up to rent to young families and individuals. At the same time, millennials are actually moving at historically low rates, and their family structure looks substantially different than past generations. Today, we're examining why the American dream is for rent and how millennials might have no choice but to buy it. Is this for the best? Whether you rent or own, are just heading to college, entering the workforce, or heading into retirement, the answer impacts us all. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on the American dream without
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, this is a good one because I've been telling my daughters that if I had to do it all over again, I might rent. But I understand some things that I was able to do because I did own a home. But I think things are changing, and hopefully what we're going to find out is the answer here and for everybody. And depending on where you are in life and what your goals are, what is the best thing for you to do in order to live your life at the best stage that you can.
So the really interesting thing, Lance, is we've talked some and we've covered throughout the past few years, the interesting position that millennials are in and trying to shed some light on the substantial differences between them and past generations, not only their taste and preferences, but also how those tastes and preferences came to be as a result of the world they grew up in and what their buying power and the workplace look like today, obviously all have an impact on what their expectations are for life. Although it's important to remember for our listeners, right, millennials are the generation. Generally, they were raised by baby boomers. So Lance, the boomer, me, the millennial, right? And following millennials is Gen Z. And we're actually going to have the opportunity to hear from our producer today, again, about his expertise on Gen Z. And that'll be coming in the second segment of the program. But the thing that's really key here, Lance, is it's kind of an interesting situation because we've covered a lot about how millennials are renting at much higher rates, right, than people in the past have. And the main reason for that, that is what's elusive. Why is that? Is it that it's truly what they want, or is it because they have no choice? Well, we're going to look into some of that, how millennials are different from a demographic standpoint in the second segment. But we got to start out with what the answer is doesn't matter nearly as much to the corporate empires, right? What they see is an opportunity. Millennials might like to own a home, especially if they're starting a family, but it might not be practical for them to do it. They may not want to do it because of the lack of flexibility. So instead, why not rent them the American dream? And this is what Lance and I came across in the Wall Street Journal. You want to tell us, Lance, a little bit about what's the concept here? What is this real estate empire trying to do?
Well, it all occurred pretty much. It's a rather new phenomenon. It occurred after the housing bubble burst in 2007, 2008. And there were all of these empty homes and nobody looking to buy them because, they actually, because of the loans they took out, they actually didn't have any kind of stake in their homes. And so they're just sitting empty. And the wealthy turned around and said, what would happen if we started buying these homes and then flipping them and then renting them? And what would the market be? And so one gentleman who actually got his start in storage units years before and became a billionaire, bought a few houses in a couple different markets, did just that, and found out he could make all kinds of money. And then it just has grown exponentially over the last 10 years. And there's a chart in the article that shows, I think it's like a 400% increase in this being done from 2010 to 2019. So it is a growing market. And what it does is it allows young families to rent the home of their dreams and not have any of the responsibility of home ownership, yet getting in the school district they want, having the yard they want, having the bedroom space and the house space that they wanted. And it's kind of been a win-win for both sides until you get into, well, who's reaping all the benefits and how does this all work? But that's kind of the quick history of it.
The idea of being a landlord is nothing new, right? I mean, the whole concept of renting is based around the landlord model. However, when most people think of renting, they probably think about somebody who maybe owns just one property, they own 2 or 3, or if they own a bunch of properties, what do they own? They own apartment complexes, right? These massive buildings with all these units in them. What they don't think of, and this is where the gentleman, Mr. Hughes, that you're referring to, this is where he's done something different, right? He's basically putting into practice being the landlord of homes on a national scale and saying not everybody wants an apartment, especially if you're going to raise a family, which millennials are at that stage in life where, yes, they're doing it at lower rates. But for the millennials that are still doing it, many of them want the option of, I want a yard, I want a place for the kids, right? We want more space. So we want a house, but it may not be doable for us to get a house. So rather, and we may want the flexibility, right, of not having to be locked into a long-term mortgage. They look at this and say, well, this might be an option. Of course, from a business standpoint, it's a prime money-making opportunity. However, it was definitely risky, but it seems to be paying off. They've managed to basically put in place a very effective buy houses, many of which are under foreclosure or condemned or what have you. They're in a state at which many buyers would turn away because it's not what they're after. They come in, buy them, and essentially flip them, but they don't flip them to sell. They flip them to rent. So they've got this massive asset ledger, right? Because they own all this property. They have relatively secure income in this model that they've set up. And the other thing that's of interest is some of the competing companies that are now getting into this game are looking to make it even more flexible by letting you, instead of canceling your lease, if you're going to move, you can't cancel it, but you can transfer it to another available property in the company's existing system. So it becomes this idea of you're owning a piece of, or you're buying a membership rather to the company, which is going to give you this option to have a house, but where you have it and how long you have it becomes more open.
You can argue that it's not good that they're taking away opportunities from young families to buy homes, and there are examples of that. But it has also met a need. I mean, it wouldn't be growing and making money. You know, these owners invested their money, and they took a risk. They were buying up houses at a time when nobody wanted them. And so now that people are doing a little bit better outside of the pandemic, but you know how the economy, we recovered from the recession in 07, 08, 09, and people are starting to look at homes. This has filled a market. They're making money off of this. So it must have been a good business venture for them. And again, because you can buy en masse, you get cheaper toilets, hot water tanks, everything else, you know, you can buy in bulk and you get them cheaper. And the great example for what they do is the state of Georgia has foreclosure properties the same day every month. And so these vultures, if you want to call them that, or these captains of industry descend in Georgia and send their buyers into every county in Georgia on the same day every month and buy up all these foreclosed houses. So it's a really strong business model. And while there are some drawbacks, we'll get into that, I guess, a little bit later, but they're also fulfilling a need in the market because they're making money at it. So if they're making money at it, then obviously people are looking at this as a viable opportunity for them to move up in the world.
Well, and these people you're talking about, you kind of mentioned, they have pretty strict instructions, right? Nothing older than 20 years or so, nothing that's too rural, nothing smaller than 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, nothing without a garage, nothing that costs less than $100,000, and nothing that would rent less than $1,000 a month. And decent schools are a must. So they're essentially, right, looking for these real opportunities to purchase in these areas that are very desirable, right? A desirable house in a desirable area, not too urban, not too rural, decent schools, prime, right, for these families. But as you said, one of the downsides to this, and this can't be ignored as people are thinking about, well, it sounds like this is, it sounds like they're doing something good because millennials can't afford, in a lot of cases, to buy these homes. So they're still have an opportunity to enter into homes without having to buy them, which on the surface does sound good. The problem is that long term, and this is a little bit what we're going to talk about in the second segment, is the question of what are you doing to the assets of the generation as a whole? Another thing that has to be considered is how much land do you want any one company to control? And it's not just lands, it's homes, right? What happens if they control enough of certain areas that they can determine what rent prices should be? We know that rising rent prices across the nation are a problem, especially in places that are close to large metropolitan areas. I can only imagine what would happen if you're now confining that to a smaller and smaller group of people.
Well, and what this doesn't do is it doesn't address the problem for younger families of how the wages have not kept up. They're not making enough money to be able to save to buy houses. The whole student loan issue, and the debt that they're incurring that they're having to pay off. So, it doesn't address the reason why renting looks good. It's not that these people necessarily want to rent, but are they in the financial situation where they can buy because of the money you need for the down payment and, just the cost of buying a home. That initial cost is so tall for them that, when this doesn't address that at all. This is just like, well, hey, we can rent you a house, but we're not addressing the fact that wages haven't kept up with inflation over the last 25, 30 years, and that student loan debt is keeping people from accruing the money needed for a down payment to buy a house and all those other things. So there's a reason why people are looking to rent. And is it just because they want to rent and they don't want to own, or is it because they can't achieve the American dream because some of these other factors have kept them down? And this is the only way they can get into a decent neighborhood and have decent schools for their children.
So Lance hinted at it. Why are millennials less likely to move than prior generations of young adults? That's right, less likely. That seems counterintuitive based off of what we've heard. Millennials are also less likely to live with a family of their own than previous generations. Why is this? And what does it tell us about the demand for homes and the changing lifestyle of the up-and-coming Americans? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we're examining why the American dream is for rent and how millennials might have no choice but to buy it. And is this for the best? That's the ultimate question, right, Lance? I mean, that's what we're always trying to look at here on The State of Us, is not just let's talk about the situation and see where you and I come down on it, but also, is this good for you, our listeners at home? Because that's what we want to answer. We want to make it practical. It's nice to talk about all this, but only in the context that you can use it. We've got a good bit of information today, and it's all linked, as always, Lance, at thestateofus.org. We do want people to take the opportunity to go there because these articles have more data than what you and I can get through here in our conversation and our limited time with people. So please do go take a look, because we kind of hinted at this in the opening, but this is really something that everybody's faced with, right? If you are ever going to have a place that somebody else doesn't pay for, if you're ever going to be responsible for your own living situation, you care about this because it's a question that you're going to have to address, whether it's on a conscious level or not. You're going to be faced with it. Do I go rent someplace? Do I buy someplace? Which is best? Could I even afford to buy someplace if it's what I want? Right? There's a lot of these questions, and they truly do impact everybody. We're looking at millennials, though, because they're the ones that are mostly in the home market right now, right? Of the people that are buying homes, they're the ones looking at it. And if you're not a millennial, you care because you might be one of those people selling your home, right? If you're Lance's age, you might be looking at, I want to retire, I might want to move, I might want to sell my home. Well, you're probably going to be selling it to a millennial. Now, here in a few years, Gen Z is going to start to enter this market more aggressively, and that's going to probably change the conversation some as well. But for right now, that's what we're looking at. And I thought this, Lance, the first thing that we want to talk about is pretty interesting. Millennials are less likely to move than prior generations of young adults. So what they looked at is the percentage of 25 to 35-year-olds who moved in the previous year, okay? So in 2016, for millennials, because that was their average age in 2016, it was 20% of millennials. Gen Xers, 26%, boomers between 25 and 27%, and the silent generation, 26%. So all living generations, right, that have the ability to purchase homes or own homes at a same point in their life, were moving at a much higher rate.
They're not moving because they can't move. Moving is it's expensive. I know my daughters have moved multiple times as they finished college, went to grad school, got jobs, looked for a different job. Moving is expensive. They have a little bit of debt, or a lot of debt, and they're looking now, but they're two different. One daughter is pretty much settled and is looking to buy a home because she's kind of comfortable where she is and has a pretty steady job. The other one is still kind of searching out there and would like to own a home, but doesn't need to buy one because they're not necessarily satisfied with where they're living and don't think that they're in a permanent place. But the best living arrangement they've had in their life was when they rented a house when they got their first job after grad school. So I've played in both markets with my daughters, but I just don't think that, they want to move, but the job market, contrary to what most people have to say, it's kind of tough. And what they find out is if you go after more salary somewhere, usually the cost of living is higher and you don't necessarily end up making more money. Or many of them are burdened with student debt. And so they can't afford to move to go anywhere because every dollar they make to stay alive on, any extra money isn't going towards saving to buy a house or to move jobs. It's to pay down that student loan that they have. So I think there's some reasons, ulterior motives, why they're not moving, not just because, we're really happy where we are. I'm not sure that that's the story. Now it might be, but in the case where, my daughters are kind of split on that. One's pretty comfortable where they are, a millennial. The other millennial is like, no, I'm not settled yet. I need to still have some flexibility on where I'm going.
Kind of to summarize what you're saying, essentially, millennials are not necessarily, it's less about what we know they want and more about what's actually available. Like you said,
the situation they're in,
right.
It's not what they'd like to do, but the situation they're in kind of precludes what their choices are.
Well, and we know that, the generations are, millennials are skewing this way more, and Gen Z even more so show higher levels of, skepticism about the future as well, right? So it's more of an acceptance of this is the way the world is. Even if I want something else, I probably can't have it. And that goes back to we've talked about the polling that, what percentage of things are outside of your control versus inside your control. And those percentages, generally speaking, are rising with younger generations in comparison to older generations. In other words, younger generations believing they have less ability to affect their future than older generations did. So all of that goes into what we're hearing. But I wanted to take a minute because I am a millennial that has done both. Have rented two different places. One was actually a house. Another one was a downtown apartment, and now Brett and I, we own our own place, right? So we've kind of got this very interesting group of experiences that for millennials of a similar age probably you're not going to find a lot that have the exact same set of circumstances. So I'm not a perfect example of what most are opting to do. But I've had this conversation with Bradley, our producer, and I actually wanted to ask him today because I think it's important that we get his take on this. as you know, Gen Z right now is really not in the market, right, for homes. They're maybe looking at renting a place, the oldest of them, but many of them are still in high school. So everybody keep in mind, you know, where that's at. But we have a Gen Z producer on the older end of Gen Z. And I'm curious, Bradley, as you think about, you know, as you've envisioned your life, right, after college, because you're going to college. Some people might be going into the workforce, but you've opted for that route. And you view your post-college life down the road. Do you see you own a home, like it's your home that you have a mortgage for, versus I rent maybe really nice places, right? Because, I mean, everybody wants a decent place. So you may look and say, well, I could rent a home, right? Or I could rent a really nice apartment. Where are you at? What do you see in your mind for the future?
Right. So I tend to value ownership more than renting, just because, I mean, you can get into the debate if your house is really a true asset or not, but I think it's definitely more of an asset than renting, because renting is just pure liability.
But, and so here, just a follow up. But you'd also consider yourself a pretty practical individual, right?
My first living situation outside of dorm is going to be an apartment, a rental place. So I'm planning on renting before owning, but end goal, as you asked me, is definitely ownership.
And the reason I asked that is because, you know, Bradley Lance, I think is fair to say, right? He's interested in looking at the numbers, trying to make the informed decision. And I think hopefully we'll have a lot of people listening today that are feeling the same. And they say, so what is the decisive answer, Lance? Right? We want to know, is renting or buying the best choice? Because that's what we told him we'd tell him. And I wish we could give him a straight up answer, but I think the answer is, and you said it in the pre-show, Lance, right? It's, what do they say in real estate about the most important thing to know? And it's the same answer.
Well, there's three things, right?
Yes.
There's three things that are important about owning a home. And the first one's location. The second one is location.
And what's the third?
Well, the third one is location. So that's what says everything about the value of your home. But I think what's interesting is we were doing our homework for this episode, we found out that the correct answer for everybody is individual. It all depends on what you want, what your goals are, and what your life situation is. And so you have to factor so many different factors that will affect what decision is best for you. And that's why you need to look at some of the things that we have for you to look at, connected to the show, because there are some places you can go to put in your personal information that will let you decide what you need to do. Because when we were playing around with it, there are some places in the country where you can, if you're going to stay somewhere for 4 years, you're better off to buy the home. Other places you had to stay there for 18 years based on your situation for you to then max out and turn it around and say that owning the home was better. So it all depends on how you want to live your life, how much money you're making, where you're living, and what you want to do in life as to whether you should rent or whether you should buy. So it's a very personal decision, and you can get wherever you want by doing either one. And you have to figure out what situation you're in so that you can figure out the best way to get to where you want to go in the future.
And if you're sitting there and thinking, okay, guys, this sounds super overwhelming, right? I mean, you said I need to take where I'm going to live into account, what type of home I want, how much I'd pay in rent, how much money I'm going to make, whether or not I'm going to be married or not. I mean, my God, Lance, right? By the time we get through this list, it's like, well, how do I even measure all this? How do I do then the math, right? Well, the good news is you don't have to do any of that. You just have to make some decisions about, what you're looking at. And what I mean there is there's a plethora of them out there. The one that Lance was referring to is called smartasset.com, smartasset.com. And by the way, of course, this is not sponsored by them. We found them purely through our own research and tested it. It seems like a pretty good website. They've actually got a lot of different stuff, but right at the top, you'll see a home buying tab. And what this is the rent versus buy calculation. You say, this is the location, right, that I'm looking to live in. And then it's going to ask you for some things. How much money do you make, right? What is your rent? And how expensive is a home that you might actually buy? And these are all things that you probably either already know or are very easy to figure out. And then what it does is it does the work for you. It says, here's what you're going to spend, right? Upkeeping your home. Here's what the average property taxes are. Here's what you're going to spend in renter's insurance. So it's going to do all that for you. It's going to give you this nice, simple chart. And Lance knows this is why Justin likes it, because if it's got a chart, right?
It's all right there, man. It beats reading. You don't have to read. You don't have to read words. Just look at the pictures and get the information.
That's right. Well, especially when numbers are involved, because math is not my forte. So we need to chart it if we're going to talk about numbers.
It's Justin's picture book, is a chart.
So if you're the same way, it's nice because it's going to show you on a very simple graph, this is your quote unquote break even. And what we mean there is that's what Lance was talking about. It's going to show you the number of years that you will have to stay in the home in order for it to be better than renting. And what Lance said is true. We were able to generate real world scenarios as little as 3 years, actually, as little as 3 years, and on the high end, 18 years. Okay. So it's a wide variance. And that's why I think it's so important, Lance. I hope that everybody listening, before you go to rent or buy your next place, you plug in these numbers. Because it's going to tell you what the smart decision is. Now, whether or not you can afford the smart decision, that's another question. Because if it tells you that buying a home, right, is the right move, can you afford the down payment? And that's the big question. So there's a lot of other stuff that goes into it, but part of what we want to talk about, Lance, is this all comes down to something. Millennials have been forced into this decision route, and Gen Z will as well, because of two things: a relatively low increase in household earnings, right, relative to the drastically increasing rent prices nationwide. What do we do about this? Because if we fix this, we go back to giving people more choice, right? They're not going to have to say, well, what do I want versus what can I do? They're going to be able to say, well, what do I want to do and what's the best decision? And that's the position we want to put people in, and that's what we'll be looking at coming up. How do we change the dynamic? How do we change the conversation and focus on improving the situation, the thing that's at the root of the problem, as opposed to just putting a Band-Aid on the issue? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
Should you rent the American dream instead of buying it? Well, in the last segment, we ended by basically giving you the answer that it's largely about location, and that's what Lance and I said, which is why every situation is different. There's a lot that goes into it, but the good news is it doesn't have to be something big and scary to take on. Smartasset.com is a great way to look it up. Again, they did not pay for this placement. We're just simply mentioning it because we believe it to be a good tool. But if you Google or Bing or whatever you do for searching on the internet, you will find it simply by putting in buy or rent calculator. You can find a lot of good options there. They're very, very straightforward. I think Lance and I were surprised at the range. 3 years, as little as 3 years, all the way up to 18 years. I mean, my goodness. And I'm sure there's numbers outside of that range as well, but these were real world scenarios based on people we know or based on us personally that we could actually plug in and say what makes sense. But now, Lance, I wanted to walk you through, because we talked about pulling back to the larger problem, right? And this larger problem is this idea of whether or not you should be forced to choose between renting or owning. We've got these two lines, right? And one of them is income, and it was going up until around 2008. And now it's kind of done this leveling off thing, right? Where it is still going up, but it's almost not noticeable that it's going up. It's inching up. And then we got this other curve that wasn't doing quite as much up until 2008. And now what it's doing, well, it's doing this steep incline, right? So, and that curve is the cost of rent around the country. And so what's increasingly happening, and one of the reasons that you've got a lot of young Americans that are living with their parents longer is, Lance shared, he knows some people, right, that are living out in California.
Well, it's just that, they're younger millennials, and they were having a hard time leaving their parents' home because they could not find and I won't even say a nice place, but a safe place to live for the amount of money that they were earning in their full-time jobs. And so that precluded that they look for roommates, because they couldn't afford a place on their own for what they were making. And they didn't even necessarily have student debt. It's not like they had big debts or anything like that, because they had been living at home and had saved money. But they were smart and ran the numbers, and there just wasn't any place for them to go, to the point that their parents looked at, well, maybe we should invest and buy a house and then rent it out to them, and to so that they could then get out of the house. It wasn't that they didn't want to leave the house. It wasn't that, the parents wanted them to stay. The parents wanted them out of the house, but it's just not, it wasn't economically advantageous for them to leave. Basically, okay, my son or daughter can leave the house and go live on their own, and they got a chance for, having something really bad happen to them, because that's the only places that they could afford were in neighborhoods that had a higher than average crime rate. So what do you do with that situation? They're working, they don't have a lot of debt, but yet they can't earn enough money to cover what the rent payments are.
If you've been listening to the program for a while, this idea is going to sound familiar, but it keeps getting refined as we talk about it. I think that this comes back to this central problem, right? Which is that a lot of young people, if you're asking them, just on the whole, right? Do you want to live in a city or do you want to live outside of a city? Just real generic here. The answer skews toward I want to live in a city, but why? Because that's a lot of what we care about, Lance. Let's figure out why is that. And my theory goes like this. The answer why is not because cities are terrific places to live. It's actually because living in a city enables the type of life that they want, right? It's all about, how do I want to live? What do I want to have access to? And then where do I have to live in order to get that? In most cases, the data tells us it's not some affinity for cities. It's what a city offers that the affinity is for. So how do we change the conversation, right? The only way to do this before was to smush all these people together, right? And that's basically what we still do today, is how close can we cram everybody in order to make it economical to provide all these different varieties of things? Well, Lance, we live in the 21st century. There's a lot of promising things going on, and COVID has actually raised this whole working remotely is really not all that bad. There was a piece in the life section of the New York Times the other day that said sweatpants forever. And it was a sketch of a flag being flown of sweatpants. And the point is that people are starting to realize, because we've been forced to, that are there a lot of benefits of leaving your home? Absolutely. But do you have to leave your home to do a lot of different types of jobs? No. Now, there are some where that's necessary, and then I'm going to talk about that. So basically, the thinking, Lance, is this. Rather than spending all this money like we do right now, right, trying to control rent and then subsidize what landlords are getting to make it feasible for them to keep owning, what we need to do is spur investment outside of cities. Make it feasible to live in places because and again, the data tells us if you ask people if cost is no object and you can have a house or you can have an apartment, what do we learn? Most people will take the house if cost is of no object. So we've got this mismatch. In order to have the life I want, I have to live in a way that I would not prefer to live. But if I had the choice, I would opt for this house. And to me, Lance, part of what makes America a great country is that we don't accept these situations and say, well, it's just a no-win. We just have to live with it. No, we don't. If we invest in the infrastructure to make it easy to get in and out of cities in a timely manner, and I'm talking about in less than 30 minutes, which, by the way, the technology exists today. It's all over the world. We just don't implement it here in this country on large scales. If we invest in that infrastructure and we invest in the infrastructure of the internet, right? Because that's a big problem in rural areas. And even in some urban ones, at-home internet is abysmal for most people. It's not very good. It might do for streaming, but it doesn't do for getting serious work done, and that's a big problem. We have to make it easier to do remote work, and for when in-person items are required, we have to make it easier to get to the places that offer those resources. Because if we start spreading out where people live, and again, I don't mean in just homes, I also mean for people that want apartments in smaller communities, making those options available as well, that to me is a big step in the right direction to solving this.
Well, but as you start to spread out, I know we're running out of time, but very quickly, the only problem I see with that, as people start to spread out, and we've seen it in the show that we did talking about the number of families moving out west into Montana and Idaho and different places like that, is that you start to price the average person out. If we started bringing more people into our area code, then that would raise the cost of living for the rest of us that live here. And the reason we chose to live here is because we don't like to have a lot of people around us. We like the slower paced lifestyle. We like getting to know our neighbors, and the cost of living is low enough that with the money we make, we can live a pretty good life, and so that's the only significant thing there, is that if we really start to set it up to expand and move people further out, then that's going to make more places even more expensive to live in. And then those of us who have chosen a quieter, slower lifestyle, as well as in a cheaper lifestyle, could be priced out of our living arrangements. And that's the only thing that I can come back at you with that says, okay, there's nothing wrong with your idea. I like it. But then all of a sudden, then maybe I can't afford to live here anymore, because you bring out more people who have more money and they raise the cost of everything. The reason it's cheaper to live out here is because nobody wants to be here.
And this is why we need our listeners' brains, Lance, right? Because it's certainly possible to overcome this very valid concern that you've raised. The question is, how do we do it in a way that is a level field? Because what we've seen and what Lance is referring to is when these areas experience this spontaneous, right, almost overnight infusion of residents, that's exactly what happens. You price out the very people that live there in the first place, which we don't want to do. So how do we do it on a scale that brings it up slowly by spreading it out to all these different areas? That's a question that I haven't answered yet, and it's one we could use your help for. TheStateofUs.org has all the information from today's show, Lance. And it's kind of, we're talking about this, right, because it is something that's not getting as much mainstream attention. And that's the very purpose of what we're doing, is trying to have that conversation and bring people in. And all the shows here at True Chat are working on that, right, Lance?
That's correct. We have a mission here at True Chat, and it is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And one of the keys, as Justin's talking about, is that we need you, not only you to listen, but to get out the listenership to your friends and to the people you work with. And so share with them about the State of Us and tell them, hey, you can find this show on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere podcasts are found. So it's really easy to find it, listen to it, and help broaden the discussion.
The State of Us is a syndicated radio program and a podcast. You can hear the podcast version on Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. Eastern time, so be sure to check that out. And if you're in near a local talk radio station, see if they carry the State of Us on the weekends. And if they don't, tell them, hey, we'd like to see this on your airwaves. And they'll be sure to hopefully reach out and get us put there. But we need your help to make that happen. So do invite other people to tune in. It's what makes these conversations all the more valuable. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butsch, for keeping us in line and getting this together. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.